Renegades by Marissa Meyer, Chapter 35. Okay, there's your new hospital tower, said Adrian, pushing the building into Max's enclosure. What else got broken? Just those apartments you fell on, said Max, pointing toward the exit. Right, said Adrian, starting to sketch. Inside the quarantine, Max carried the new tower over to the hospital building. He set it down on the broken stump, working mostly single-handed as his right hand was heavily bandaged. Adrian watched as Max used his forearm to hold the tower in place while wrapping his left hand around the break. Slowly, the glass began to melt together, forming a seal that wasn't perfect. A visible crack was still evident where the material had merged, but it seemed solid enough. Adrian swallowed. He had seen Max use that particular gift a number of times, probably more than any other power he'd absorbed. It made him think about what Nova had seen, Max using his telekinesis to hold dozens of glass buildings in the air at once. Truthfully, that mental image had not left him since Nova had told him. He'd been trying all morning to find a way to ask Max about it, but he hadn't yet found a way to do it that didn't sound accusatory. Instead of asking the question he really wanted to ask, he said, "How's the hand?" "Could be worse." Max looked down at his bandaged palm. "They had to cauterize the artery. That's where all the blood was coming from. But the spire went right through here." He lifted his left hand so he could show Adrian. "In this meaty part between my thumb and finger, so it missed all the bones and tendons." He shrugged. "I guess it would have been a lot worse if the wound had been more central, but, it hurt pretty bad as it was." "With any luck, you'll have an epic scar to show for it." A fleeting smile passed over Max's face. He stepped back to inspect the hospital, then picked his way back toward Adrian. He sat down at the edge of the bay while Adrian sketched out the crushed apartment building. "Hey, Adrian," he started, cradling his bandaged hand in his lap, picking at the edges of the wrapping. Adrian looked up, immediately hesitant. It wasn't very often that he heard Max sound being worried about anything. "What's up?" Max sat up a bit straighter, but still didn't meet Adrian's eye. I have Ace Anarchy's power." Adrian watched him, waiting for him to say something else, but this seemed to be the extent of his confession. "Yeah," he finally responded. "I know." Max shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "Do you think—" He trailed off. "Do I think what?" "Do you think I might be evil?" Adrian's eyebrows shot up. He leaned back, pulling the marker's tip away from the unfinished drawing. "Or," Max continued, "that I have some evil powers in me?" Adrian waited for Max to look up at him, but the kid kept his gaze resolutely on the floor. "No, I don't." Max's mouth puckered to one side, unconvinced. "I knew you'd say that." "Because it's true," Adrian said with a laugh. "Is this why you pretend you're no good at it? Is this why you've hidden how strong you are all these years?" Max looked up, his face rife with regret. He didn't answer, but Adrian could see the truth written plainly on his face. Sighing, Adrian capped the marker. For starters, most of the horrible things Ace Anarchy did, he could only do because he had that helmet. Once they got the helmet, he was... for telekinetic, he was still pretty strong and all, but not nearly like before. And more important than that, what we do, what any of us do, it's just a series of choices, right? Take fire elementals. Every fire elemental has a choice. They could burn down buildings, or they can make s'mores. He intended it to be funny, but Max frowned, looking unimpressed at Adrian's attempts at being clever. If you had the power to do everything Ace Anarchy could do, you would have chosen differently. You would build things, not tear them down. He gestured at the glass city. Case in point. This finally brought a small smile to Max's mouth. "Speaking of building things," said Max's eyes brightening, "I discovered something this morning. Want to see?" Without waiting for an answer, he got up and bounded back to his rooms, returning a moment later with a slim red marker. He crouched down in front of the wall and began to draw onto the glass. Soon he had completed a rudimentary sketch of a car. When he was finished, he capped the marker, then pressed his forefinger into the car's center and pushed. Adrian was already grinning by the time the car popped out of the wall, landing in the palm of his hand. It was roughly the size of his palm, a little lopsided. The wheels did not turn. It also did not have the same solid feet that one of his own glass figurines had, but rather there was a softness inherent in the material. A malleability, like glass that was on the verge of melting. All that aside, it was real. "Why, you little bandit," he said. "You stole my power." Max grunted. He was staring at the car with obvious disapproval. "I'm not a very good artist, and there's something wrong with all the things I've made so far. They're not stable like yours. I did some things on paper first, and they just crumple like tissue paper as soon as I pull them out." Adrian turned the car holder, holding it by the hood, when the whole thing drooped down toward the floor, bending nearly in half. Sorry." Max shrugged. "You weren't in here for very long, so I didn't get much of your power, which is good. If I'd gotten it all, then I'd be stuck making new buildings for the city, and they wouldn't be very good." "Maybe at first, but I could give you drawing lessons." Adrian tried to bend the car back into shape, but it was quickly losing its form. Already it sat in his palm with the consistency of bread dough. Giving up, he set the clear blob down on the floor. "Do you know how much you got from Nova?" Max shook his head. "She was in here for longer than you were, but it still wasn't that long. You showed up right when it was happening, but I guess we'll see." His frown deepened. "I wish there was a way I could turn it off. I don't really want her power. The last thing I need is 8 more hours of boredom every day." Nodding in sympathy, Adrian drew his own version of Max's car into the glass and pushed it through. Rather than picking it up, though, Max just scowled. "Show off?" "Can't help it." Max's posture changed suddenly. His spine stiffened, his glower turned more thoughtful but also hesitant. "Adrian?" The way he said it made Adrian tense up too. "Yeah?" "When you were in here, after you grabbed Nova..." His eyes narrowed, and he wasn't looking at Adrian, but staring blankly at the glass car. "You flew." Adrian's pulse thumped. The words hung between them, solid as the wall that divided them, for far too long before Adrian forced out a small chuckle. "I think you might have been seeing things. All the blood loss, probably." Redness flooded Max's cheeks, and when he did lift his eyes, they were flashing with anger. "I'm not stupid." Adrian swallowed. "I didn't mean..." "Okay, maybe it wasn't actual flying, but it wasn't normal either what you did. You jumped..." He glanced back, measuring the city with his eyes. "At least 14 feet, and you weren't even running or anything at the time. You just took off." Adrian stared at him in his mind as his mind searched for an explanation, but nothing came. The silence felt impermeable, and Adrian wanted to break it, but he had nothing to say. Finally, Max sank back onto his heels. "You know, I've seen videos of another prodigy that can jump like that too." Adrian's pressed his lips together, as if the confession might emerge of its own accord. Already he was debating if it would really be so bad to tell Max the truth. He could be trusted with the secret, couldn't he? Clearly he'd already figured it out, at least guessed. So much harm would there be in admitting it? But still he hesitated, because as much as he loved Max, he also knew that Max loved Captain Chromium, and Adrian couldn't be sure where most of his loyalties lie. And Adrian still wasn't ready for his dads to know that he was a Sentinel. Their expressions when they got into headquarters last night after they heard about what happened in the quarantine were burned into his memory. Fear and panic, relief coupled with concern. Not just for what had happened, but more for what could have happened. Adrian knew it wasn't just the fear that he might have lost his powers, which would be hard to come to terms with at first. Wouldn't have been the end of the world. But it was also the fact that he nearly died at the library. That still had them shaken up. Perhaps, too, their nerves were running high from the captain's brush with death at the parade, even if neither of them was admitting how close it was. Being a renegade was dangerous. It had always been dangerous. A few superheroes tried to persuade themselves otherwise. It was just the fact of this life that they had chosen, or that had chosen them. But if his dads found out that Adrian was also the Sentinel, had taken on Nightmare at the parade, visited the anarchists in their tunnels, faced off against the detonator at the library, and charged headlong into the fire, their anxiety would skyrocket. He didn't need to put them through that. At least, that's what he told himself. It was for them. He was keeping the secret for their own well-being, to protect them from their own worries. But he also knew that this was a selfish decision. He wasn't ready to hang up the mantle of the Sentinel, and he knew they would ask him to. What he didn't know was whether he would listen to the request or not. Right now, it seemed easier to stay silent. "Okay, fine," said Max once it became clear Adrian wasn't going to admit his assumptions. "You don't have to answer. I saw what I saw." Adrian looked away, his shoulders weighed down with guilt. He wished he could explain to Max that it wasn't personal, that he wasn't ready to tell anyone. He said simply, It's complicated. Max guffawed. Yeah, and I don't know anything about that. Adrian cringed. But one thing did occur to me, said Max, tapping his marker into his palm. This guy called the Sentinel. You might have heard of him. The Sentinel, he's been kind of on the news a lot lately. Adrian shot him a wry look. Sounds familiar. Right, so as far as I know, this guy they called the Sentinel and I might be the only prodigies alive who claim to have more than one superpower. At least we both have multiple, totally unrelated superpowers. Not like Tsunami, who can both create water from nothing and also manipulate existing water. But he can make fire and do the whole jumping thing, and now they're saying he has some fancy new concussive energy beam. Whereas I have, he tapped the pen against each fingertip as he counted, telekinesis, metal manipulation, matter fusing, some invisibility, he pondered. Absorption, obviously. Now, whatever it is you do, what do you call it anyway? Adrian was smiling again. He knew Max was working to cross a divide caused by Adrian's unwillingness to talk about his secret. It felt like a compromise, and he was grateful for it. I just call it sketching, he said. But I think it's listed as Artwork Genesis in my profile. Artwork Genesis. Cool. That's a good list, isn't it? It's an awesome list. Truthfully, it was more impressive than Adrian realized. He rarely saw Max use any of the abilities he had gathered from prodigies, most of which he had been absorbed when he was a child. Telekinesis from Ace Anarchy, metal manipulation from the matter fusing from his birth parents, a bit of invisibility taken from the Dread Warden before they realized what it was he could do. Now, of course, Adrian's power, and maybe even some of Nova's. He may not have been powerful in all of those abilities, as demonstrated by the card that was now a jiggling pile by Adrian's ankle, but he was powerful enough. In fact, if he wasn't trapped inside this quarantine all the time, he would have made one hell of a superhero. Adrian opened his mouth, ready to tell him just this, when Max blurted out, Can the Sentinel give himself any power? Adrian blinked. Don't say that you don't know, Max continued hurriedly. Just pretend that you're guessing or whatever. This is how it works, right? He's somehow drawing the powers into reality? Or does the Sentinel actually have power mimicry? In Artwork Genesis isn't the original power at all. Shutting his eyes, Adrian massaged his brow. He paused and sighed heavily. Okay, if I had to guess, he returned his focus to Max, peering at him intently, hoping to convey that should anyone else ever ask about this, even if it was only a guess. He's still figuring out how many powers he can give himself, and the overall extent of the abilities, he's sort of making it up as he goes along. I figured, said Max in a tone that made Adrian bristle. But do you think, has he tried invincibility yet? Invincibility? You know, like the captain. Adrian leaned back on his hands. Somehow, he hadn't given much thought to replicating either of his dad's powers or any of the council's. Perhaps it felt too much like crossing an uncrossable boundary. He could never become Captain Chromium or the Dread Warden. He would never replace them, but that's not what any of this was about anyways. But to imbue himself with their abilities, especially the Captain's invincibility or super strength, would have seemed almost disrespectful to everything Captain Chromium was, everything the world admired. But at the same time, he knew precisely why Max had asked about this power among all the superpowers of the world. Because of his invincibility, Hugh Everhart was the only prodigy who could get close to Max. Though Max did a good job of hiding his loneliness, and Adrian largely tried not to think too much about it. In that moment, it became clear how much he must yearn for interactions that weren't divided by a glass wall or a chromium edge suit. I don't know, he said finally, slowly. I honestly don't know. Max nodded in understanding, and Adrian could tell he wasn't angry at this response. It was the truth. Adrian didn't know if he could bestow himself with invincibility on any level, and certainly not to the level of his dad's. Max must have recognized the honesty in his words. But already, Adrian's mind was swirling, considering, wondering. You should go check on Nova. Adrian startled. What? I bet she's really freaked out still. It seemed like she actually enjoyed being awake all the time. I'm not sure enjoyed is the right word, said Adrian, trying to recall her exact words when they had talked about how she spends her time. But I do think she's proud of what she's accomplished because of it. She doesn't just read comics and draw like I probably would. Instead, she made herself into a renegade. Exactly, said Max. And I might have taken that away from her. Shaking his head, Adrian moved to stand. Never. She's one of us now, whether she likes it or not.